Guess I got cut off. This is the Cold War Part 2. One of the things I forgot to mention about the House Un-American Activities Committee, that it was originally only meant to be temporary to monitor foreign agents, and it became an official standing permanent committee in 1945. And Alger Hiss was a State Department employee who was suspected of being a Soviet spy, and he was convicted of perjury for denying being part of a spy ring and sentenced to 5 years in prison. His entire time that he was in prison, which was for those until 1954, he insisted that he was innocent. So the Senate had their own sort of witch hunts going on, as well as the House of Representatives. In the Senate, Senator Joseph McCarthy led what became ultimately known as McCarthyism. And he decided that in 1950, partly because of the Alger Hiss issue, that the State Department must be infiltrated with communists. So he starts subpoenaing people to testify before him and his Senate committee. But he was often drunk and he would ask really off the wall, inappropriate questions. All walks of life were suspect during this time. Careers and reputations were lost simply because of mere suspicion. If you said no or refused to answer his questions, you could become a target, or your friends and neighbors could become targets. Over 300 filmmakers were blacklisted, meaning they couldn't get any work. And Edward R. Murrow, who was a famous news reporter at the time, wrote a report on Joseph McCarthy, and he used footage to show him as dishonest in speeches and abusive to witnesses. And people started to see this on television, which was a very new mass medium in this time. And in 1954, he went on live TV and he actually decided that he was going to shift his attack from Hollywood and the State Department to the U.S. Army. And he actually starts to accuse generals and colonels in the army of being communists. And at that point, they start to fight back, and the Senate actually turns around and censures or publicly quiets McCarthy, and then later he dies of health complications from stress and alcohol abuse. So the McCarran International Security Act is sponsored by McCarthy and passed despite Truman's veto. It was overridden. And what this does is says that there should be a subversive activities control board to basically monitor communists in the United States and to spy on them, so domestic spying. And then the second McCarran Act is passed in 52. Again, it keeps and increases national origin quotas, so again, more immigration restrictions, but it also banned the immigration restriction on Asian immigrants. So we start to see more Asian immigrants coming into the United States in the 1950s. The other thing is we had a massive arms buildup, and it's based on this idea of massive retaliation and mutually assured destruction. So meanwhile, we are pursuing not only the first atomic bombs, but now hydrogen atom bombs, and those were even more devastating. And we were also looking for missiles that could then be launching them, and you wouldn't have to put them on airplanes anymore. You could launch missiles intercontinentally, so they were called intercontinental ballistic missiles. We were doing a lot of above ground nuclear weapons tests, not only in Nevada, down at the Nevada test site, but we are also doing these above ground tests out on the Bikini Atoll out in the South Pacific. Many of these tests, people would sit like in St. George, Utah with their sunglasses on, or in Las Vegas and watch them. And the fallout from them really caused a lot of radiation diseases in not only Utah and Nevada, but also parts of southern Idaho. There were higher incidences of thyroid cancer, breast cancers, lung cancers, etc. The fallout would be caught by the jet stream, and radioactive materials could be traced all the way to Washington, D.C. as a result of these above ground nuclear tests. The National Security Council decision in 1954 was to depend primarily on our great capacity to retaliate instantly by means and at a place of our choosing, meaning we could launch missiles anywhere from anywhere. And so we had missile silos primarily all over the West, but we also had them back east. And those missile silos had strategic targets all over Eastern Europe and Russia. And just the Russians could do the same thing. And so the idea was that because we could level the planet, that we would actually never level the planet. So this idea of mutually assured destruction meant that we were not likely to ever enter into World War III. Dulles was a man who gained the initiative instead of piecemeal response to the communist aggression around the world. He was like, let's go out and combat it rather than just sort of try and stop it. He was like, let's go prevent it. And a lot of people were kind of resistant to that because it was sort of preemptive. But he was a strong believer that we needed to go and nip it in the bud. So here you have the effects of nuclear destruction. In Cuba, you see that the Cold War actually heats up. In 1959, there's a revolution, and Fidel Castro and his brother Raul, who is actually now in power because Fidel is old, some people suspect might be dead, but somebody did say they saw him recently. The Soviets, taking advantage of this communist revolution in Cuba, make arrangements with the Castro brothers to actually bring in Russian missiles to the island of Cuba in 1962. This becomes known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it is pretty scary time and the closest we get to World War III. In the October of 1962, over a period of about 13 days, John F. Kennedy, who was president at the time, establishes a naval blockade around the island of Cuba. And basically, it's kind of like a pretty scary game of Battleship. The Soviet convoys were on their way, and they needed to turn around. And the question was were they? And what if they don't turn around? Do we shoot at them? So it was a really, really nerve-wracking time. So it was really back and forth. Meanwhile, while they have this military operation going on, there are some back channel negotiations. How do we get Russia through diplomacy to pull their missiles out of Cuba? 90 miles off our coastline, those missiles were predicted to be able to hit Washington, D.C. So it was imperative that we did not have those there. So through some back channel networking, it was agreed that the United States would pull our weapons out of Turkey if they pulled their weapons out of Cuba. And that is what ultimately ended the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1954, we began sending advisors to French Indochina as Dien Bien Phu falls. And Indochina was part of formerly, which is today Vietnam, French territory. And the French had asked for our assistance. During this time, we have a peace treaty that is formed in Geneva that divides Vietnam into communist North Korea or Vietnam and a pro-French South Vietnam with sort of puppet leadership, a democratically elected president. However, it was really somebody hand-selected by both the United States and the French. In 1956, the South refused to hold elections because the Northern communist leader Ho Chi Minh would have won those elections. And so again, we prop up another puppet in that region. And so then the North Vietnamese invade South Vietnam. In 1963, President Diem in the South is assassinated. And by then, we're in a full-fledged war. In 1964, the U.S., we kept increasing kind of every year our advisors that we were sending to Vietnam. And by the time we get to 1964, we actually have the Navy patrolling the Gulf of Tonkin. And there are these, quote, air quotes, attacks on U.S. destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. It was said that somebody tried to attack these destroyers that they suspected were North Vietnamese, and therefore LBJ goes before Congress and asks for war powers authorization. He does not ask for a declaration of war. The resolution said that there was an air war and ground troops, and that we could send ground troops to aid South Vietnam and wage an air war against North Vietnam. So on August 7th, a joint resolution is passed to protect our interests in Asia. This was a highly unpopular war at the time. We were during the Gulf of Tonkin in North Vietnamese waters. The ship that was claimed to have been shot upon or fired upon was the USS Maddox. And both ships claimed that they saw incoming torpedoes with sonars, but there was actually no evidence, and that comes out later. So we managed to go to war and stay at war, and each year the war escalates. By 1968, hundreds of thousands of men are over there, and thousands of men have already lost their lives. In 68, LBJ decides not to run again, and Nixon runs and wins. And in 1973, he realizes that there's no way to win this war, and that there needs to be peace with honor. The American public had definitely turned its back on the war, and he begins to withdraw troops. By 1975, the capital city in South Vietnam collapses and is invaded by the North Vietnamese, and there are some pretty powerful images of the airlifting of refugees out of there. Because there was a lot of fear among the South Vietnamese that if they had helped the Americans, that the North Vietnamese would try to torture them and attack them. So this is Robert McNamara. He had been involved in all of the wars, but he was Secretary of Defense under Lyndon Johnson, and he is one of the people that orchestrated that Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And he and Lyndon Johnson worked very closely at how we waged our war in Vietnam. And he is who the film Fog of War is about. You can see here the headlines when Nixon, this is Henry Kissinger right here, negotiates the peace with honor and a ceasefire and the freeing of POWs. This is Nixon in Vietnam or with some troops in Vietnam. And this is the American embassy with helicopters airlifting people out of Saigon when Saigon collapsed. So by 1971, the State Department analyst Daniel Ellsberg leaked some documents to the New York Times that revealed that the U.S. government actually lied about the Gulf of Tonkin. So that even further turns Americans sour on the war in Vietnam. And we'll talk about when we get to sort of America in the 60s and 70s, sort of how American popular opinion about the war in Vietnam really did change our view of war in general and what sorts of wars we'll be willing as citizens to support. The Supreme Court actually, because the president tried to block the publication of those papers claiming that executive privilege, but the Supreme Court of the United States upholds the publication and says no, that you have to share them and that they are part of the public record. So Nixon negotiates with Ho Chi Minh and withdraws troops in 1975. Saigon falls. And then after that, so we've built up our arms, just huge, huge amounts of missiles. And in the meantime, we've also conducted a space race, the Russians and the Americans in a race to see who could be on the moon first, and those sorts of things. So now we're starting to see that maybe we should start limiting our arms production and reducing our arms because we could destroy the world 10 times over. So between 1969 and 72, we worked on strategic arms limitation treaties, or the SALT I, to really reduce the number of arms. Between 1972 and 79, we negotiated even further reductions. They included reductions like on above ground testing and then on below ground testing. So even the nuclear weapons tests, there are bans and treaties that say you can't test the weapons because even that is viewed as posturing and threatening to your neighbors. Think about North Korea, and every time they launch a missile into the Sea of Japan, everybody gets all upset and they're like, oh, we're just testing. And it's really threatening and scary. Then Ronald Reagan comes to office and says that in 1985 we must stand with our democratic allies around the world. And this becomes known as the Reagan Doctrine. And during his presidency in 1983, fearing a pro-Soviet regime was taking over in a civil war in Grenada, he orders an invasion to topple that government. In the mid-1980s, he supported a group of Contras who were fighting a rebel group called the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, and the communist group were the Sandinistas. In Afghanistan, we sent arms to the Mujahideen, who would later become known as the Taliban, who were fighting a war with the Soviets. Another great movie that you could watch is Charlie Wilson's War, which kind of lays out our history in Afghanistan, going back to the 80s and what happened in the 80s and how that really kind of set us up for what happened with 9/11.